Good evening and welcome to the 2021 Three-State Beef Conference. My name is Chris Clark and I'll be serving as your host this evening. I'm a beef specialist with Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, headquartered in Lucas County, Iowa, and covering central and south central Iowa. The conference is a cooperative effort of Iowa State University Extension and Outreach, University of Missouri Extension, and University of Nebraska Extension. I want to take a moment to recognize my fellow committee members and all the work that they have put into this year's conference. So also from Iowa State University is Erica Lundy. She's a beef specialist headquartered in Adair County, Iowa, and she covers Southwest Iowa. From the University of Missouri Extension, we have several field specialists in livestock, including Amy Schleicher, who serves as the chair of the planning committee for this conference. She's headquartered in Atchison County in the northwest corner of Missouri. Also from the University of Missouri Extension is Jenna Monig in Mercer County, Sean Deering in Gentry County, and Jim Humphrey in Andrew County. And representing the University of Nebraska Extension on the committee is Dr. Mary Dranowski, Beef Systems Specialist and Assistant Professor at UNL, Dr. Casey McCarthy, Beef Cow-Calf Specialist and Assistant Professor at UNL, and Connor Beeler, Extension Educator in Beef Systems in Saunders County. So this will be our 36th annual conference, and our focus has always been to address topics of importance to the beef cattle producers in the three-state region. Now, normally our speakers travel to each of the three states on three consecutive evenings. And as we are all very well aware, this year is anything but normal. So due to the coronavirus pandemic, we made the decision to go virtual this year. And we appreciate your flexibility as we do things just a little bit differently this year. So hopefully you all heard music during the introduction. Of course, now the music should have stopped and hopefully you can all hear me okay. Just a couple kind of housekeeping items to help you navigate the virtual conference. So Connor Beeler has agreed to be our conference tech support person for this evening. If you have any technical questions or if you run into any problems, you can reach out to Connor by phone or email. Email address and phone number are both listed here on this slide, and you might take a moment just to jot those down in case that something does arise during the presentation. While you're doing that, I want to highlight just a couple features of how to interact in this virtual format. So we would like these sessions to be interactive, and we encourage you to ask questions and offer comments via the chat feature in Zoom, or you can use the Q&A box as well. If you're watching on a computer, there's a row of buttons, typically at the bottom of the Zoom screen, that you may have to use your mouse and kind of hover over the bottom of the screen to get those buttons to appear. And then if you're watching on a smartphone and use the Zoom app, you may have to swipe through a few screens to access that chat feature. Once you get there, there should be a box where you can type in your question or comment there as well. So you can also choose whom your question or comment goes to in the drop-down menu of the chat box. If you're using that, please send questions to all panelists so that we can help the speaker monitor questions this evening. And feel free to send those questions at any time during the presentations. You don't have to wait till the end. And finally, I want to remind you that we are going to record this presentation this evening, and it will be available later for viewing kind of at your leisure. We'll send you those details via email at a later date. So as always, we wanted to make the proceedings available for participants in the conference. And given the virtual format, we got a little fancy with the proceedings this year, and we made them available using this QR code. You should have also received an email that had an attached PDF document and a link that would also take you to the proceedings. So hopefully you've been able to print those or access those, and you can follow along and take notes and stuff if you would like. So our speaker tonight for the first of 3 evenings of the Three-State Beef Conference is Dr. Scott Brown. Scott is an associate extension professor in the Division of Applied Social Sciences and the Director of Strategic Partnerships for the College of Agriculture, Food, and Natural Resources at the University of Missouri. Scott has worked with U.S. Congress over the past 3 decades in determining the quantitative effects of changes in dairy and livestock policies, and has testified regarding dairy and livestock policy issues before House and Senate Ag committees. In addition, he works with the Missouri legislature on the economic effects of state policy options on Missouri ag. Scott received his PhD degree in agricultural economics from the University of Missouri and his BS degree in ag business from Northwest Missouri State University. He grew up on a diversified farm in Northwest Missouri. Scott, welcome and thank you very much for being here.
Chris, thank you very much for having me on tonight. I appreciate the chance to speak at the 36th annual event here. Quite an accomplishment, and I appreciate all of you that have made your efforts in making this one possible, given all of the constraints that we face. So for those of you that are listening or watching tonight, I hope that as we go, you will use the chat function at the bottom and ask questions as we go. I always feel like it's nice to get questions as we go instead of just listening to someone that speaks for the next hour without any interruption. I am probably taking a little different road than I would have in the past, in that I'm really trying to get us to think about how do we do risk management, especially from a cow-calf producer standpoint. And I hope as we go tonight, you all will understand at the end of the night that there's no one right way to do this. I think every operation is going to have their own specific ways to worry about risk. I sometimes will often say having no risk management plan it is in fact a plan. It just may not be a very good one. And so as we start here tonight, I felt like this circle kind of really identified for me the things that we have to do in a risk management plan. And I think all of you probably right away are going to go, hey, it's all about price risk management. I go, there's a lot of other things I think we can do in this industry but beyond just straight price risk management. I go to the left side of the circle for a minute just to say, what are the things you can control? And oftentimes I think, there's a lot of production-oriented pieces of this puzzle that you have direct control over. And sometimes we may talk about those as genetic choices being made in your individual herds. I go, let's make sure that we're doing the best we can on the things we can actually control. If I was really good at price projections, I probably wouldn't be here tonight. I often say to audiences, because I could have made a lot of money. So none of us know exactly the future of prices. There's some things I think we can talk about as we look forward in terms of some projections, but let's work on the things we can control. Let's continue that process of analyzing the data that's available to us. It reminds me as I start tonight that I remember talking to a large feed yard manager who told the story about one time buying this set of calves, and he said, we paid 30% over market for those calves that day. And he said, I walked into the little restaurant that was there with the sale barn afterwards, and nobody really knew who I was. And he said, we were the talk of the restaurant with, gosh, those guys really paid way too much for those cattle to go in the feed yard. And he said, little did they know that they had fed that gentleman's cattle for the last 3 years, and he knew that they were going to make money on those cattle just the way they fed, the way they graded, et cetera. And so that analysis of what your operation looks like is important. It is a never-ending task in terms of risk management. So as I go tonight, some of the components that I want to try to cover with you. So again, I put at the top prices. We often think about price risk management all the time, and I go, that's part of it. We can use things like futures and options and forward contracts, et cetera, to manage that risk. And by the way, and we'll get to this towards the end, feed and cattle matter here in this discussion. We've kind of lost sight of high feed costs until lately again. And I just remind you, that's one of my worries as we look into 2021. But we can use those traditional tools. And in fact, as you look at some of what USDA offers now, some of the LRP options that are available are for smaller operations. So in fact, almost anyone can do some type of futures market activity these days without a lot of cost. We can choose different market outlets. I think we often find ourselves, and I get in a rut in everything that I do on a regular basis, but thinking about the best way to market or where to market is always, I think, an important part of that, whether you want to do video auctions or you're going to continue with a sale barn that you've built a long-term relationship. I go, all of those are possible good alternatives for you, but at least to think about them as you go time to time. And of course, seasonality. May not work for some of us, but I hear a lot of folks, again, who are claiming we'd sure like to see some more fall calvers in some parts of the country that give us an option maybe to sell feeder cattle at some higher spring prices. Cattle genetics, I always go, you might find me often talking about carcass quality and the demand for some of those higher end beef products, but it's more than that. As we think about those genetic choices, things like feed efficiency, animal health, all matter. And I hear a lot about, should we be feeding cattle? Should we get in that feeding business? And I just want to make sure that if you're thinking about currently a cow-calf operation that might expand into other parts of the chain, you better do all those very efficiently. So evaluate each of those enterprises separately, because if you want to continue to think about, hey, I might want to feed cattle, I better make sure I'm efficient at each stage of that process moving forward. I thought this was a useful few graphs to talk about. So this was a master's student that I had that finished a year and a half ago now, that looked at, so the Thompson Farm Research Center, it's located in Spickard, Missouri. I say north central, some might call it northwest Missouri. But it's really spent a lot of time focused on adding quality to those carcasses. The steers from Thompson Farm have been fed at various feedlots over the years. Many years they were fed in a feed yard in western Kansas. And I just wanted to look a little bit at the results, because there's a couple of things that I think really come out as we think about this data from the Thompson Farm. And number one, we have data all the way back to 95. It's roughly a 200 cow operation. It's primarily Angus, and I don't talk about it just because it's an Angus operation. So for those of you that might be looking at something other than Angus, don't read anything into Scott saying I should get in the Angus business. But I want to look at just how this operation has changed over time, and it's nice to have a lot of data available to us. So I'm going to get right to some results for us. If you look at the gold line that I have on this graph, so this is kind of the average fed cattle value, or fed steer value, if you will, for that. And again, you notice at the bottom, these are birth years, not sale years. So we'll see, for example, back in 2014, when I said even Scott Brown can make a profit in the cattle business, the average value was about $2,200. The black line then traces what did those steers, so again, roughly 85 or 90 steers a year that were headed to be fed in a feed yard, either Kansas or now Iowa. In its peak, it was about 2,350 back here in 2014. But you notice there's a gap almost every year. Not in this 2017, which I sometimes remind us, again, feeding cattle is its own risky business. We probably had some issues there with the steers that were fed in that 2017, 2018 period. But you'll notice, again, some recovery. Now, it's roughly $200 is the way I look at it at maximum that we were talking about from the steer side. But if you look carefully, you'll start to notice, with the exception of 2017, what was an expanding value that Thompson steers were showing over the average in the United States. I sometimes remind us that you can stack those genetics over time, and I think that starts to show up in these herds. Now I go, if if you looked at the Thompson cow herd, sometimes I look at it and I go, a lot of cows that look, gosh darn, awful close to being identical. But each one of these diamonds that you see year by year, it's the value of that individual steer carcass. And you'll notice even what is a herd that looks mighty, mighty similar, there's a lot of variability in terms of the top to bottom. Now, some of those bottom observations, we probably had cattle that got sick in the feed yard that didn't do as well. But there's always work to be done. And again, I think we want to narrow that distribution. There are a lot of other factors like weather at play that certainly are going to affect the distribution from top to bottom. But again, I just wanted to make the point by looking at these individual diamonds on a year by year basis, there's a lot of difference in value in what's a herd that looks, again, an awful lot alike in terms of those cows. Now, I sometimes say that the female side of this equation is likely where I'm seeing the stack genetics play even a larger role. We were looking at the heifer values coming out of Thompson Farm relative to what was an Oklahoma City bred heifer value. Now, you may say that Oklahoma City bred heifer value is pretty low value. I don't disagree with you, but I want to make the point here about the trend that you see. Every year of continuing to add better and better genetics is a winning recipe for growth over time. It never ends. Now, making those correct decisions are going to be important because incorrect decisions, I think, also can set one back over time as well. But you take both the steer value and the heifer value, and you'll notice that we were talking about 34% roughly of the value coming from the steer side, about 30% from heifers. We're also at Thompson Farm marketing some of those calves that either there were heifers that didn't breed back or that were open, I should say, or they were otherwise behind maybe the rest of the herd. But you notice the gap in total in terms of what's kind of a weighted value per cow, if you will, that has been growing across that period of time. Again, I just want to close on that section by saying it's always important to think about what can I do with my herd. I think it's much easier to sometimes make those decisions than it is once we get into what I will say is some of the price side of this equation and things that we should be paying attention to. So timing of cattle sales, it's always important. You know, I sometimes say, I don't think we always want to hit the tops necessarily. Well, maybe we want to hit the tops, maybe we want to hit that home run, but it's going to be by chance as there's just so many market effects that can really change things. But seasonality can provide market opportunities. We'll look at a little bit of the data that's available from a Missouri perspective. I keep harping on being flexible. I sometimes say, to me, we have folks who wean the same week, they take them to the sale barn the same week, and being just flexible within a few weeks sometimes can help. So in terms of those market outlets, and again, this is where we could get back and talk about, do video auctions fit in your operation? How many weeks can I be somewhat flexible in terms of when I want to market those feeder cattle? Am I willing to hold them another 30 days? Trying to maybe see some price strength at times. And I'll say, we always want to be careful down this road because anytime we keep cattle longer, it certainly increases price risk. And I remind us, price risk is both upside as well as downside. And if we're just sitting here trying to pick those high prices, I think that's impossible. My crystal ball, especially in COVID-19, no longer functions. And I think, I don't know what the next thing may be, and hopefully it's nothing as severe as we've gone through with COVID-19, but there's going to be other factors that come along that we'll never be able to predict. I always say disease events certainly are some of those that make this important. So there's only so much in terms of that timing that we can talk about. So I have a graph here that just looks at by month, and again, this is 2017 through 2020 data. The top line will be 300 to 400 pound calves. These are the average of all of the combined Missouri auction markets over this period of time. And you can see as we go down through those, we're adding weight to the mix. There is something to seasonality here. Again, I hear sometimes, and especially right now, with what's been a end of 2020 where we were running a lot of feeder cattle into the feed yard, that I think some sure wished we could spread that out. For those that might be able to do some fall calving, I think there are some possibilities for some higher prices when we get in the spring months on average. Trying to, again, it's the average may be a little deceiving here. It's going to always depend on exactly where we are in the cattle cycle and those events that unfold for us. But generally, that might be an option that someone wants to think about in their operation. And again, any data that we kind of look at highlights that we typically, especially for those lighter weight calves, tend to see $10 to $15 higher prices in the spring than we may in the fall months. I just want to look at price slides here for a little bit as we look at the next three slides that I have in my deck here. I just remind you that it's always $70 that's setting on the left-hand axis from top to bottom. So the gap as we go through these three slides are the same. This is happily January of 2005 data that's available to us. I kind of draw your attention to the line that's drawn through there that kind of looks at the slope as we go through time. There again were slides as we added weights to these calves. It flattened out once we got to about 700 pounds, but not maybe typical slides that we would think of. If we then now look at January of 2013, and again, $70 here. All right, so although we've moved those prices up considerably as we go from 300 pounds to 900 pounds, there's still $70 from top to bottom here. You'll notice, and again, here's 2005, and here's the January of 2013 data. What were feed yards saying? So we were already starting to talk about being short calves, and they were clamoring for lightweight calves to get in those lots earlier, and certainly were bidding well for those lightweight calves. I sometimes use this as that might have been an opportunity to make sure that we let somebody else own those calves. So, we often talk in Missouri about we don't feed many cattle in Missouri. They tend to go to other states. And maybe we should be feeding more cattle is the gist of the conversation. And I sometimes, as the economist, will say, I think there are times where it might have made sense to feed more cattle. And I'm not going to even say in Missouri, but maybe to have retained ownership of feeding those cattle. And there are other times I'm more than happy from somebody in a neighboring state, let's say Kansas, take the risk of feeding cattle. So having that flexibility, and again, here's one where we were short calves generally as we were talking about fewer cows in the herd, et cetera, that to me might have been an opportunity for somebody else, especially when you think back to January of 2013 when we had some pretty gosh darn high feed costs. And as we look here at December of 2020, data that we had from last month that again to me would suggest less hurry in terms of marketing those cattle. We weren't seeing the same kind of slope that we would have seen back in January of 13. I guess here I'm just trying to again make the point that having flexibility in when you choose, and maybe I want to keep those calves for a period of time longer, and it might make a lot of sense. And maybe sometimes I want to retain ownership. This might be a good period of time for some to think about retaining ownership of calves. And oh, by the way, retaining ownership of calves that you know the genetics about and how they perform in the feed yard, all of that only helps reduce the risk of feeding your own cattle. So as I switch gears here a little bit and talk about retained ownership for a minute, I simple examples here. All right, I just want to make a few points. We're talking about selling either 575 pound calves in early November, turning around and talking about feeding those cattle until late May, and them bringing or weighing 1,275 pounds, a 1.5% death loss in our examples. And then using the cost of gain as reported by Kansas State University, their focus on feedlots. I'm picking specific periods of time, that early November, late May. Timing matters when you're feeding cattle here in terms of profitability or not profitability. But that's just a little simple example. And I want to look over the 2000 and forward period. And this is the strategy of, hey, I could have sold those feeder cattle in in early November, or I could have kept them and fed them until late May. What was the right strategy? This is a straight cash only strategy. So you're not going to do any kind of risk management. Number one, you can notice some of the volatility that we face in that line. 2017 was certainly a good year. And I'll say that was a good year because from 2016, when I could have sold those feeder cattle until I could sell fed cattle in May of 2017, we saw a big increase in cattle prices, generally pulling all those prices up. That made 2017 an incredibly profitable year. But you'll also notice a lot of years where we were losing money feeding cattle. The average, which should have labeled out here, but did not, that's the average over the entire period. Not a lot of money on average to be made feeding cattle. This is kind of this base case, if you will, for me as I think about feeding average cattle. So now I want to look at what happens if we have not average cattle to feed. And my first strategy here is, what if I have carcass quality? So I get some of those cattle to grade prime or upper choice. What's that do to the bottom line? And yeah, we're maybe too simple of an example for all of you tonight, but just want to remind us that, we're adding somewhere roughly $4,000 on average to that feeding possibility. So some of the years that would have been negative with just the base case now all of a sudden are slightly positive. The average getting close to about $9,000 just by adding that $5 premium. So now what if we keep stacking better genetics? So what if all of a sudden I have calves that have a 5% increase in feed efficiency relative to the average? Now all of a sudden you see a lot more of these, I call it a pink line, maybe it's a red line, but the triangles that all of a sudden every year actually shows some positive returns. And all of a sudden on average, we're talking about $18,000 instead of $9,000. And so those are the options. And all of a sudden I reduce death loss by just 0.5%. It adds even more. So to me, back to this whole idea of, do I know my calves well enough to know that they're above average? And if they're not, what do I need to do to make changes? And if they are, I help my risk of feeding cattle, I think, greatly as we look ahead. And again, that may be way too simple of an example, but I think it makes a difference in terms of the decision about, do I want to retain ownership of cattle moving forward? Now, I don't highly recommend feeding cattle straight in a cash strategy with the risk of both feed prices and cattle prices. So the black line here, again, still my base case with cash only, but now the gold line is I'm going to hedge those cattle. So I'm going to sell enough fed cattle contract when I put those calves in the feed yard in early November to reduce that risk. And you'll notice in 2017, for example, all that gain in cattle prices went away. I shouldn't have hedged those cattle. They would have been better off to have not been unhedged. But I sure reduced the volatility. And I remind you, some of you may be able to handle more risk than others. So maybe you can handle the volatility that comes with being in a cash only situation. But for those of you that can't, I'd remind you, there's ways to reduce that volatility. And most of these feed yards have programs, even if you're going to retain ownership in someone else's yard to do that. If you look at the dots here off of the right-hand side, you'll actually notice that doing forward contracting actually lowered the average over that entire period just a little bit. That's part of the reason why we do price risk management. We're trying to get rid of the volatility. Unfortunately, we get rid of both sides of that volatility taking this strategy, both low prices as well as high prices, and something that we'll have to pay attention to. I always say, if I'm going to lock in cattle, I probably want to lock in some feed as well along the way here. And so this is the last comparison of what's my straight cash comparison, relative to locking in both feed costs as well as those cattle prices. And again, I reduce the volatility. It looks a little different than just doing cattle, but I'd remind you that that combination is probably something that we need to look at. And so now to come back, and this is, and sorry, this is Southwest Missouri. So Joplin Regional Stockyards, I've got both 4 to 5 weight calf prices and 5 to 6 weight calf prices. These are also from early November. And it's the range from top to bottom in those prices. And sometimes I like to remind us that there's some trend, and the last observation or two here, we flattened back out again, but back in 2003, you looked at a 4 to 5 weight range. We had prices from top to bottom that were about $18. If I went to 2017, 2018, that range has gone to $35 those couple of years. I just remind you that range has been growing. And sometimes I think that those calves that have been running through Joplin Regional Stockyards that have some history to them, history that those that are purchasing them know about, they're willing to pay higher prices for those calves relative to calves with maybe a more unknown background to them. And so the spread's been growing. Now, we may argue that it's the bottom end calves that are bringing less, maybe not so much the top end calves are bringing more, but I think both are happening. And the days of having below average calves and getting much for them, I think continue to become more numbered as we look ahead. And so you don't have to necessarily feed those calves every year to decide, what strategy you want, but do you know how your calves are going to perform in a feed yard puts you in a much better position as you think about marketing those calves. Again, do I want to do it via video auction, or do I want to make sure whatever sell barn I may be going to, that they know how those calves perform and make sure that that information is available to those that are willing to bid on those calves. I again, don't think you always have to maintain ownership to get the value. I hear all the time, Scott, I never see how many of my calves grade prime whenever they finally are hung on the rail or upper choice. And I say, that's not necessarily what you always have to do. It's knowing enough about that side of the equation to make sure that you market them as well as you can. And so again, I think there are opportunities, and I think those will continue to unfold for those higher quality calves to bring more money than, again, those calves we know less about. Turning to carcass quality here for a minute, the gold line here is the prime box beef price. The red line that you see, the middle line, is the choice. Anytime we usually talk about a box beef price, we're talking about the choice box beef price. My point is, you look at that gold line, I always want higher value for my carcass, not lower value for that carcass. I will say, in a COVID-19 world, so we get over here to the right-hand side for a minute. If you think about all of the discussion we had relative to COVID-19, it was the high-end restaurants that we talked about that were closed, most problematic in terms of not having a home for maybe some of the higher value beef products. But if you notice, prime prices have come back very nicely as we've gone through 2020. And we're still talking about a lot of these higher end restaurants not having a lot of in-seat dining options. But I think despite that, they've been able to see stronger demand, whether that's takeout, carry out, et cetera, that's occurring even at that level. But for prime to run as strong as it had in the face of COVID-19, which again, I would say was hardest on those higher end restaurants, is a testament to me to the demand that still is there. Now, we've been growing prime supplies or upper choice supplies over time, and that I think will slowly erode. And in fact, if you look back here in 2011 through 2013, we had much higher prime relative to choice prices. It's narrowed a lot as we kind of look at the current year. And to me, that's the supply side slowly catching up with that new demand. But I think that focus on carcass quality certainly is going to add value, even though we may be seeing some narrowing occur over time. If you look at the data that's available, so USDA, Agricultural Marketing Service, AMS, gives us the loads of different types of beef. And again, I'll say loads of prime are still fairly small. You notice that it's been growing, getting up to about 3,000 loads that we see of prime here in recent observations. Even branded and choice seeing growth generally, but that select side of the equation, which by the way, I don't want you to compare the right-hand side of this graph to the left-hand where this hole is. If you think back to what happened right here in 2013, that was the government shutdown and we did not get data over that period of time. So that's the only reason why that observation there is missing. But the idea that we're seeing a lot less select, I think that's going to continue to be the mode as we look ahead. And we're going to, again, see more demand on that quality side. Just a different way to think about what's been happening to demand for different grades of beef. So prime here off the right-hand axis. And again, I'll just remind you, it is small, but it's amazing. Even in 2020, we've seen some pretty good growth in that prime. And when I think wholesale value, this is measuring both the quantity that we're moving as well as the price we're moving it at. And so both those things, I think, certainly give us some good opportunities for higher valued. And even when you look at branded choice, we're seeing some pretty good growth. So I want to spend just a little bit of time doing outlook, I think, as everyone thinks about their own operation. So again, I don't think we can predict prices with any degree of certainty, but we can certainly think about the issues that are in front of us in terms of where are prices generally headed. I think number one for the cattle industry generally is that we've got a beef herd that's been in contraction. You know, we were peaked in January of 2019. I think we're going to continue to see some reduction in beef cow inventories as we get the January 2021 data from USDA here in just a few weeks. Demand for meat. So we've come through what's been an incredibly difficult time from a COVID perspective. And again, I think it was harder on beef than maybe it was some of the other meats. I think demand could look better as we get into 2021. Trade to me is also a positive, both from exchange rates that have maybe made our products more cheap as we went through 2020, but then also other countries that are recovering from COVID-19 as well. I'll take the Japan in particular that I think could be a real boost for us as we look into 2021. So both sides of the equation for me, both supply and demand, are in a situation where I think generally I can get more optimistic about where cattle prices are headed in 2021. That may take us the first 6 months before we start to see some more of the positive, but a lot of things here that have me more excited. So here's where we sit in terms of beef cow inventories. You'll notice that I'll continue to talk about a projection of reduced beef cow numbers. I think drought's going to matter here. We've certainly seen a marked increase in dry weather in some of the western parts of the United States. And as much as I think that's a very bad situation for those folks, I sometimes say it may help us here in some parts of the folks listening tonight, in that, yes, we've had some dry weather. I don't want to downplay some of what I've seen in parts of Iowa, Nebraska, but generally better off than what we're seeing out here in some of the worst of the western droughts. If we look at the data, I sometimes say, you take the weighted average of the top 30 beef cow states and look at the D1, so moderate drought or greater. You look at the 2020 data, and it's frankly not out of the norm in terms of average. Yet when you look at what's happened during the weeks as we went through 2020, and we don't have all that data yet from USDA, but the average was 27.4%. And you notice just what's been happening. To me, that just helps keep the tide of beef cows down in some of those Western states and continues to help us from a price standpoint. I think, we have to think about that here in the Midwest in terms of how we take advantage of the situation. And number two, I think we're getting beyond the heavyweight cattle that we faced when we had processing plant slowdown, shutdowns. And that's going to be a help in 2021 as well here. As you see the last few observations, we were all of a sudden getting 10 or 15 pounds. And I know you may go, that's still a big increase relative to normal, but I'm much happier to see a end of 2020 where we were 10 to 15 pounds above year ago levels relative to the 45 pounds that we saw during some weeks back in the worst of the COVID-19 plan issues that we faced. So I do think we're going to see both beef supplies as well as cattle inventories that give us some help in terms of the supply side of the equation. And for a minute, just to look at the trade side, I'm still optimistic about where we go on the trade side. If you look at what's been happening quarter by quarter here, again, Japan remains our strongest market, but South Korea certainly saw a nice rebound in the third quarter of 2020. The line that I'm going to continue to pay attention to here is the line that's China, Hong Kong. It's been some phenomenal growth. If the Chinese decide they want a lot of U.S. beef, 2021, 2022 are, I think, going to look really good for the cattle industry. They can certainly pull things higher. And just to highlight what's been happening, China's taken nearly 12% of our weekly shipments over the last 12 weeks of data that we have available to us. I don't want to, you look at this black line that's the 2020 numbers that we have in front of us, and I'll just say those are still small, all right? Small in terms of total quantity, but that growth has just been phenomenal. And if that continues, as the pork industry can attest to from their billion pounds of additional pork that went to China in 2020, I think that, again, has a lot of reason for us to be optimistic as we look ahead. If I have a few concerns as I kind of start to close here for you tonight, number one is I think COVID-19's put a big wedge between farm prices and consumer prices. So CPI for food off the right-hand side, usually talk about a much smaller percentage in terms of consumer prices relative to prices received by farmers. And this is not just cattle, this is all ag prices, but you notice these higher consumer prices, and at least for the beginning of 2020 with the worst of COVID-19, lower prices received by farmers. It just reminds me to say COVID had a lot of costs, whether that's social distancing in plants, the processing, the transportation and distribution costs that we saw. We added a lot of costs. If we get post COVID-19, maybe we're going to continue to see some shrinkage between the farm level and the consumer level, but it's one that we're going to have to continue to watch. One that I continue to worry about is just the total load of meat that we're pushing to U.S. consumers. In 2020, about 206.5 pounds per person of beef, pork, chicken, and turkey we were putting at consumers. You look at that relative to back in this period where we had record high cattle prices and we had about 185 pounds of those four meats. We're pushing, again, a lot of meat at consumers. Do at some point consumers balk about what they're willing to pay for the load of meat that we're really putting in front of them. Now, the good news is it looks like for 2021, we're actually going to be down. And I would, again, predict for 2022 another reduction in per capita consumption. So maybe we've hit that peak and we won't find that to be too big an issue, but something that I continue to pay attention to. And the last one here. All right, so this is a little bit of corn S&U. If we look for a minute at the left-hand side, so this production side of the equation for a minute. So this is looking at how USDA has changed their projections of the 2021 corn supply and demand estimates over the period. So back in back in September relative to August, USDA came down in production 378 million bushels in terms of that projected corn harvest. And if you look at then what they were doing, they also had exports up 100 million bushels, domestic use down 200, but ending stocks down 250. They would have in September raised their estimate for corn price to $3.50 a bushel. And I think a lot of us were sitting back here in August going, maybe another big crop, maybe some lower feed costs. But now you see as we kind of then go through time, and today USDA released their estimate for January. And for the 2021 year, they're now saying corn prices at $4.20 a bushel. I now have the yellow bar setting here for you. So that's a billion bushel reduction in corn production from where their estimate was back in August. One of the biggest adjustments in yields for the January data that we've seen for a while. I remind us that's then now drawn down stocks. So we have a lot more concern about where these feed costs go going forward. I'm not telling you to go out there and lock in a bunch of feed costs right now, because we've seen a pretty good run up in prices, but we're likely going to deal with this as we get through all of 2021. Any kind of dry weather in 2021 likely gives us another spike in feed prices. I'm curious to see what happens from a planting decision standpoint. I think we'll push a lot of acres of both corn and soybeans, but there's feed price risk that we haven't seen for a while. And just given the reduction in ending stocks that we've seen, we have to manage that risk more than we've had for the last few years. Now, I think sometimes there's been some confusion, and I should be careful using the term confusion, but China certainly has been demanding both more corn and soybeans, as we've talked about that phase one trade deal that took place in early 2020. But it's the combination of reduced supplies here and higher export demand that has pushed those corn prices higher. And you're going to want to watch as we go forward. For me right now, focus on South America crops and what we get in the bin in South America is going to be important here in the short run. But we need to manage on these feed costs in a way that we haven't had to for a while. My last few slides for you here, just to say, I'm expecting higher cattle prices. You may have hoped that I was going to give you higher ones than what are projected here, but for the next couple of years, I see more upside potential in those prices than downside risk. And again, as I summarize, I sure hope risk management becomes more important as you think about your own profitability puzzle in your operations. I again work on the things you can control first, whether that's your cost side of the equation. And I know sometimes folks get tired of economists talking about cost minimization, and I'm not talking about necessarily cost minimization. I'm talking about managing the cost in a way that make sure that you maximize profitability. That's always not necessarily cost minimization. Think about that genetic base of the herd. However, I still don't think there's a one size fits all in this whole discussion of risk management. I hope folks will think about what are some strategies to reduce price risk. Again, using futures markets. It may not be talking about hitting the market highs, but it's talking about reducing volatility. And again, as I just look at the outlook, I can be more positive about where we're headed. And I think we're well positioned as we move ahead. With that, I'm going to close. I think we have a little bit of time for questions. Turn it back over to those that are managing, maybe to handle the questions.
Yeah, Scott, we have had a couple questions come in. And while we're starting to address these, if anybody else has questions or comments, feel free to use that chat box and question and answer box. Let's see. The first one here is, what situations do you recommend using options versus futures in a cattle feeding enterprise?
So I think the answer to that is certainly it depends. So we have to look at the cost of those options relative to using straight futures markets. I know that some folks get a little leery of straight futures contracts. So if you're just dipping your toe in the water, maybe sometimes it makes sense to use options as the strategy. But sometimes those options are very expensive. It depends on where cattle prices have been moving in terms of what are the premium costs of buying those options instead of going straight in the futures market. But I know sometimes folks aren't all that interested in having a broker call and say, I've got a margin call for you, and I need you to come up with money. For those of you that are thinking down this strategy, I always go, the financial side of this matters. The lenders need to be a part of that risk management plan for you so that everybody's on the same page. And so sometimes I'll say using straight futures markets, if you can handle a full contract, may be the right strategy. It just depends on those premium costs. And for some of you that might be smaller that are out there, USDA's made some changes, and risk management agencies made some changes to the livestock revenue program that's out there, LRP contracts. And sometimes I'll say for those of you that just don't really feel comfortable doing that kind of risk management, remember that LRPs traditionally sold by crop insurance agents. Not all crop insurance agents in the country are going to sell LRP contracts, but several of them will. And I sometimes will say, don't tell crop insurance agents I said this out loud, but you can do one head. There's little risk in doing one head to learn how to use things like LRP. And sometimes I go, for me, LRP is almost like an options activity for producers. And so there's less risk there. And given some of the subsidy increases that have happened in LRP, it may make more sense at times to be using LRP. But to blanket say there are right times or wrong times to use options versus futures, for me, it's all about the cost of those options contracts relative to being in the futures market.
Okay, thank you, Scott, for that. Let me find this next question here. This question was, what about the cost profit comparison between consumers, producers, and packers?
So I'll take that question and go with it where I think it was intended. And I think there's a lot of question about, who's maybe making the most profit all the way from the farm level to the consumer level. I think there's been a lot of concern about whether or not there's enough negotiated cattle trade in the market today. I will say, I think it depends, where the profit really lies. I will go back to 2013 and 2014 and say those were the years for the cow-calf producers for sure. Tight cattle supplies certainly put us in the driver's seat from a cow-calf perspective. As we grew the beef cow herd, you kind of look at 2018, 2019, and all of a sudden we were almost up against some capacity constraints in the cattle side. We talk about that a lot in the pork industry, not so much in the cattle, but the data certainly changed for us and put packers in a much better position than maybe they'd been for a while. I don't remember anyone getting too worried about packers back in that 2013, 2014 period when they likely ran red ink, but they certainly have done fairly well. And COVID-19 created some very unusual situations where we had, very high beef prices and lower cattle prices. And I know some question that, and I'll sometimes say, I'm not certain that if we would have had more negotiated trade, whether we would have had lower cattle prices than we had back in April or not. I know it wasn't a fun time for a lot of folks. I just think we're going to see a lot more discussion about how the cattle industry moves forward with all of the components from farm to retail. Again, for us tonight, I will say fewer cattle supplies to me means it's going to be a potentially better period of time for calf producers. The only caveat to that is feed costs may be the tough part here.
Okay, Scott, the next question asks if you would be able to give us a quarter by quarter Fed price prediction.
Like I said, my crystal ball's a little cracked in terms of doing projections these days. The thing that I will say is that for me, the second half of 2021 is likely where I expect us to find higher prices relative to 2020 than the first 6 months. And I say that because number one, we're still talking about a pretty heavy load in terms of COVID cases. We have a number of areas of the country that are still talking about restaurants that aren't fully open. We still, I think, are going to have a pretty good run of cattle for the first half of 2021. And so I think that's going to be somewhat at play, I guess, as you try to pin me down here a little bit. I would say that, if you look back at 2020, we're going to have had fed cattle prices that for the last quarter of 2020 would have averaged a little less than a $1.10 over that quarter. I'm not going to be surprised for us to be at $1.20 by the time we get to the fourth quarter of 2021. Maybe second quarter prices that are $5 above where we would have been second quarter of 2020. And again, I'll remind you that second quarter of 2020 was the tough quarter for us. We averaged about $1.06 there in terms of fed steer prices for the second quarter of 2020. So $1.10, $1.15 range in that second quarter, I guess, is where I'm at. And again, I come back just to say I think there's more upside potential in that fourth quarter relative to what I gave you for that $1.20 than downside risk given where I see markets today. Now, we have COVID-19 that sticks with us forever, or we have an FMD outbreak here in the United States and those bets are off. But that's a little bit of what we see in terms of a little bit of quarter by quarter projections.
Thank you, Scott, for that answer. A couple more here to kind of wrap things up. What are the changes that have improved LRP in the last year?
So I think the biggest changes and is related to an increase in the subsidy available for the premium that one would pay for what's essentially getting that option contract. So it used to be fairly small subsidies available, and those increased with some changes that USDA made. So it makes LRP more attractive, all else equal, than would have been the case historically. And that, frankly, is the biggest change. I only highlighted those changes because if somebody looked back at using LRP prior to those changes, I encourage you just to go back for another look. It may make more sense than in the past, because I sometimes would have said one might have been better off using a straight option strategy relative to LRP, just given the small subsidy that was available for those LRP contracts. And that has changed and worth, again, a little bit of exploration. And again, I come back to say, with LRP, I can just do a very small amount of cattle. It helps me dip my toe in that water without feeling like I have too much risk.
And finally, Scott, what are your thoughts on how Missouri prime beef will affect the Missouri cattle markets? I assume that means Missouri prime beef. That's capital MO in front of the prime beef.
Yeah. Yeah. So I'm not. I'll take this question this way, and maybe I'll misinterpret what was meant there. So I think, number one, the larger increase in prime beef that may be available as we get into 2021 only helps and if this is a Missouri focused question, I go, the more prime we can create, I think the better the value back to the Missouri cattle industry over time. And again, I guess as I look at 2021, I see a chance for prime prices to get a rebound. As I sometimes, so I'm going to struggle here a little bit with, and I'm going to go to the demand side of this equation and trying to answer this question. So number one, we know that we've had a lot of economic drag generally as a result of COVID-19. But I think when we get out of the worst of COVID-19, there's going to be some pent up demand. And if I want to go have a really good meal, what am I going to go get? Chicken breast, right? No, I'm kidding here tonight. I go, so I'm going to go get a really good steak. And so I think there's going to be some pent up demand for some really high quality product. And I think we're just well suited here. So the more prime that we bring, I think the better off it is. And again, I think there are real options for us in a state like Missouri, where I think we have maybe some genetics that are more suited to that to generate some value as we move ahead. Now, I will close by saying we should never just be single focused on one part of that genetic puzzle. Only focused on carcass quality creates other issues that we want a balanced approach, I think, as we move forward.
All right. Thank you very much, Scott. I don't believe I'm seeing any more questions coming in at the moment. So give me just a moment here to pull up a new screen. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and go through just a few closing comments here as we kind of wrap things up. So just a few housekeeping items as we wrap things up here, kind of before we let you go. Again, thank you very much, Scott. And I'm not having much luck. I was trying, maybe one of my panelists could help me. I was trying to type or paste into the chat box there the link for Dr. Brown's Brownfield Ag News weekly update and for his YouTube channel. Because those are some other avenues where you can access Dr. Brown's information and expertise. Please watch your email for evaluations. We will try to send out some evaluations. We really appreciate your time and effort in filling those out. We know it takes a little bit of time, but we honestly do use those evaluations. Every year we sit down and look at comments and ideas for future programming, and we use that as we plan the program for the following year. So please look for those that will be coming via email. Additionally, we want to just give you a quick heads up on some upcoming programs. So with 3 universities here, we've got a lot of quality programming that we're all working on. The first one here is preparing for managing for the calving season. This is a 2021 Beef Watch webinar series from the University of Nebraska-Lincoln. And I'm going to go through these quickly, but if you missed the details, you can contact any of us on the committee to get details. The other UNL extension program listed here is another webinar series. This one's about stocker and yearling management. If you're familiar at all with the Beef Improvement Federation, or BIF, their annual meeting and research symposium is going to be held this year in June in Des Moines, Iowa, and it will be hosted by Iowa State University Extension and Outreach. So we're really excited about that, and we wanted to make sure that you were aware of that opportunity. And finally, the University of Missouri Extension continues to offer Forage and Livestock virtual town hall meetings. So these were held from April to November as, I think, weekly meetings. And as of late, they're being offered as monthly webinars. And there are a couple remaining sessions, February 11th and March 11th. And then, of course, you can access recorded sessions through the MU YouTube channels. And again, if you didn't catch all these details, feel free to reach any of us on the planning committee here, and we'll try to get you all the information that you need. And finally, thank you very much for attending. Please join us again tomorrow, same time, same place, for Dr. Weber's presentation on matching genetics to your marketing strategy. Again, thank you very much, and please take care.